In the isolated Colorado Territory mountains during the winter of 1867, something occurred in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine Ridge that would challenge everything the townsfolk believed about the nature of human consciousness itself, as well as faith and science. Words spoken by a 9-year-old boy named Samuel Henderson would save 17 lives, 3 days before anyone knew those lives were in danger. So deep was the incident buried by the authorities that over a century would pass before the truth surfaced, hidden within a collection of personal letters discovered at a Denver estate sale in 1973. What you're about to hear is more than another tale of frontier superstition. It's a documented case that medical experts still can't fully explain, involving a child whose mind seemed to operate beyond the normal boundaries of human perception. No fewer than 43 witnesses recorded the boy's predictions, including a traveling physician who would later stake his entire career on studying this single case. Contained within the Colorado Territorial Archives were depositions from clergy, miners, and even a U.S. Marshal, who investigated claims of fraud only to conclude that something genuinely inexplicable had occurred in that remote mountain community. Before we continue with the story of Samuel Henderson and the mystery that divided Pine Ridge, understand that this channel isn't for everyone. It is only for those brave enough to uncover the darkest secrets of American history. If you're ready to explore mysteries that science still can't solve, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. Few channels dare to tell the stories we tell here. And if you've made it this far, you're not like most people. Now, let's dive into the chilling events that began on a snow-covered Sunday morning in February 1867. The story begins not with Samuel's prophecy, but with the strange circumstances that first brought him to Pine Ridge. Circumstances that would prove far more significant than anyone could have imagined at the time. Like a forgotten prayer carved into the Colorado mountains stood Pine Ridge, a settlement of barely 300 souls clinging to survival 8,000 feet above sea level. Sprouting around the Pine Ridge Presbyterian Church in 1864, the town began when Reverend Jonathan Matthews led his congregation west from Missouri, seeking to establish a pure Christian community away from the moral decay they believed was consuming the eastern states. Months at a time of isolation from the outside world had been created by the harsh winters and treacherous mountain passes, forging a tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone else's business, and where faith was a daily necessity for survival, not just a Sunday obligation. A modest structure built from local pine and granite was the church itself, with a bell tower that could be heard echoing through the valleys even in the fiercest storms. More than just a place of worship had been built by Reverend Matthews, a stern but caring man in his 50s with graying hair and eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. He had created the heart of a community that relied on each other for everything from shared harvests to collective prayers for protection against the mountain's many dangers. Hand-carved pews that Thomas Henderson had crafted himself featured in the building, each one bearing subtle religious symbols that reflected the deep faith of its makers. 20 miles down the treacherous mountain road was the closest significant settlement, Silver Creek, a booming mining town where men sought their fortunes in silver and often found only death in the unstable mines. The contrast between the two communities couldn't have been starker. While Pine Ridge emphasized moral living and collective salvation, Silver Creek was a place where loose morals, gambling, and violence were as common as the silver dust that coated everything in the town. Their isolated location had been deliberately chosen by many Pine Ridge residents to escape the corrupting influence of such places, viewing Silver Creek as a necessary evil that provided them with supplies and occasional news from the outside world. Among the first to follow Reverend Matthews to Pine Ridge had been the Henderson family, drawn by the promise of a community built on Presbyterian principles and the chance to raise children away from the sinful influences of more populated areas. Many of the town's homes had been built by Thomas Henderson, a skilled carpenter and devoted Presbyterian, with his own hands, including the parsonage where Reverend Matthews lived and the schoolhouse where the town's children learned their letters alongside their scripture. Evident throughout Pine Ridge was his craftsmanship, from the intricate woodwork in the church to the sturdy cabins that sheltered families through the brutal mountain winters. The town's unofficial midwife and herb healer was Margaret Henderson, her knowledge of medicinal plants proving invaluable in a place where the nearest doctor was days away by horseback. Her skills had been learned from her grandmother in Missouri, who had passed down generations of knowledge about which plants could ease pain, reduce fever, or help women through difficult births. Dozens of carefully tended medicinal herbs were contained in Margaret's small garden behind the Henderson cabin, and her reputation for healing had spread throughout the region. To assist with births or treat serious illnesses, she often traveled to other settlements, carrying her leather satchel of dried herbs and homemade tinctures. For years, the Hendersons had struggled to have children of their own, a source of deep pain in a community that viewed large families as a sign of God's blessing. 3 miscarriages had been suffered by Margaret in their early years of marriage, each loss deepening their sense that perhaps God had different plans for their lives. Constantly they had prayed for a child, and when that child finally came into their lives, the circumstances were so unusual that many in the community saw it as a direct answer to their prayers. Their prayers seemed answered in the spring of 1858 when Thomas found an infant boy abandoned near the ruins of a burned Ute settlement about 5 miles from Pine Ridge. But far more complex and disturbing than the simple tale of an abandoned child that the Hendersons told their neighbors was the true story of Samuel's discovery. Farther from home than he usually ventured had been where Thomas was led, following game trails while hunting deer in the dense pine forests that surrounded their settlement. The site of what appeared to be a small Ute family camp was the area where he found the child, but one of devastating violence was the scene that greeted him. Scattered around the burned remains of a traditional shelter lay 3 adult bodies, their corpses bearing evidence of gunshot wounds and knife cuts. Everywhere were scattered personal belongings, jewelry, tools, and religious items that spoke of a family that had been in the middle of their daily routines when death came calling. In a carefully constructed root cellar beneath the main shelter had been hidden the infant boy, wrapped in a buffalo hide blanket that had protected him from both the fire above and the cold mountain air. But Thomas quickly realized that this was no newborn. At least 18 months old appeared the child, old enough to walk and speak simple words. That someone had hidden him deliberately was suggested by the boy's survival, taking the time to ensure his safety even as violence raged above. More disturbing still were the signs that this had not been a random attack. Evidence of torture was shown by the bodies, and the systematic destruction of the camp suggested that the attackers had been searching for something specific. Evidence of digging around the camp was found by Thomas, as if the killers had believed treasure was buried there. That the site was considered sacred by local Ute bands would be revealed by later investigation, a place where medicine men came to conduct vision quests and communicate with ancestral spirits. A decision that would haunt him for years to come was made by Thomas. He took the child and buried the bodies himself instead of reporting the massacre to the territorial authorities, creating simple grave markers that he hoped would provide some dignity for the dead. Partly practical was his reasoning. Over 100 miles away was the nearest territorial marshal, and by the time help arrived, any trail left by the killers would be long cold. But a deeper understanding of the tensions between white settlers and Native Americans also motivated him, tensions that might have made life dangerous for any white family known to be raising an Indian child. To their community as an abandoned infant they had found during a hunting trip was how the Hendersons presented Samuel, and the boy's obvious need for care made their neighbors more sympathetic than suspicious. In a frontier community where death was common and orphan children needed homes, the adoption seemed like a natural act of Christian charity. 2 weeks after his arrival, Samuel was baptized in Pine Ridge Presbyterian Church, with Reverend Matthews declaring that God had clearly intended for the boy to be raised in a Christian household. But Samuel's true origins left their mark on him in ways that wouldn't become apparent for years. Deep psychological scars that manifested in unusual ways had been created by the trauma of losing his birth family, combined with whatever he had witnessed during those terrible hours in the root cellar. He suffered from nightmares that left him screaming in a language that Margaret didn't recognize, and he often seemed to be listening to sounds that no one else could hear. A serious boy with dark hair and unusually pale green eyes that seemed to take in everything around him was what Samuel grew into. Small for his age, he possessed an uncanny ability to sense changes in weather, often warning his adoptive parents of approaching storms hours before clouds appeared. Strange but not unfriendly was how the other children found him, and he had a particular gift for finding lost items, a skill that had made him popular among the town's adults. That Samuel had been blessed with spiritual sight was often joked by Mrs. Henderson, though she never imagined how literally prophetic those words would prove to be. More pronounced became Samuel's unusual abilities as he grew older. He could predict which of Margaret's pregnant patients would have difficult births, and his warnings allowed her to prepare the herbs and equipment needed for complicated deliveries. Instinctively he seemed to know which wild animals were dangerous and which were safe to approach, a knowledge that kept him safe during his solitary explorations of the mountain forests. Most remarkably, he could sense when someone in the community was seriously ill, often appearing at their door with Margaret's medicine bag before she had even been summoned. A reputation as a special child was earned by Samuel through these abilities, but they also created a certain distance between him and the other children in Pine Ridge. His help was appreciated by parents, but they were sometimes unsettled by his intense gaze and his tendency to know things he shouldn't. Aware of this distance seemed Samuel, and he became increasingly withdrawn as he grew older, spending more time alone in the forests around Pine Ridge, where he felt most comfortable. Particularly harsh had been the winter of 1867, with snow falling almost continuously since November. For over 2 months, the community had been cut off from Silver Creek, relying on stored provisions and the occasional successful hunting trip. During this period of isolation and hardship was when the strange tensions in Samuel's background would finally surface in a way that would change everything. Clear and bitter cold dawned February 18, 1867, with temperatures well below freezing and a wind that cut through the thickest wool like a blade. One of those profound silences that only occur in deep winter at high altitude had been brought by the night before, when the cold is so intense that even the usual night sounds of the forest are muffled into submission. Samuel's restlessness during the previous evening had been noticed by Thomas Henderson, the boy pacing their small cabin and staring out at the star-filled sky with an intensity that reminded Margaret of his worst nightmares from early childhood. Nearly the entire community had been drawn by the Sunday morning service at Pine Ridge Presbyterian Church, as it always did during the harsh winter months when collective warmth and shared faith provided comfort against the mountain's relentless hostility. Beyond its normal capacity was packed the small church, with 47 adults and 16 children crowded into pews designed for a smaller congregation. Thick with the scent of wool clothing, wood smoke from the pot-bellied stove, and the lingering aroma of the pine pitch that Thomas Henderson had used to seal the windows against winter drafts was the air inside. A sermon about Job's trials had been delivered by Reverend Matthews, drawing parallels between the biblical patriarch's sufferings and the hardships faced by their own mountain community. The authority of a man who had led his flock through genuine hardship was carried by his voice, and his words resonated with people who understood intimately the challenges of maintaining faith in the face of isolation, danger, and material deprivation. With the focused attention of people for whom such sermons weren't merely theological exercises, but practical guidance for daily survival, listened the congregation. In the third pew with his adoptive parents sat Samuel Henderson, his pale green eyes fixed on Reverend Matthews with an intensity that several observers would later remember as unusual even for him. That Samuel seemed different had been noticed by Margaret that morning, more alert and focused than normal, but also somehow distant, as if part of his attention was turned toward something only he could perceive. To the restless night he had spent had she attributed his strange mood, but as the service progressed, she began to sense that something more significant was happening. That Samuel suddenly stood up was during Reverend Matthews' discussion of Job's faith in the face of inexplicable suffering, his movement so abrupt and unexpected that the wooden pew creaked loudly in the otherwise silent church. But the confused movements of a child disrupting a service weren't these. With a strange dignity and authority that seemed to transform him before the congregation's eyes rose Samuel. "The earth trembles beneath Silver Creek," said Samuel in a voice that seemed to carry an otherworldly authority. His pale green eyes staring straight ahead, as if looking through the church walls into some distant vision. With a gravity that number 9-year-old should have possessed came out the words clearly and precisely, each syllable articulated. "The number 17 shall be spared by the warning of the crow. The mountain shall swallow the greedy, and the silver shall run red with blood when the sun reaches its highest point on the 3rd day hence." Into the kind of profound silence that seems to have weight and substance fell the congregation, broken only by the crackling of wood in the stove and the distant howling of wind through the pine trees outside. The exact quality of Samuel's voice during those moments would later be remembered by every person in that church, how it seemed to carry harmonics that resonated in their chests, how it commanded attention in a way that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to some deeper part of their minds. Continued Samuel, his voice taking on a strange cadence that seemed to blend English with sounds that reminded some of the older settlers of the native tongues they'd heard from Ute traders in years past. "Kokoapeli Kina Mashitube. The old spirits remember the sacred places where blood was spilled. 17 souls walking in darkness, but the crow brings light to the shadow places where silver men dig their graves. Instinctively for her son reached Margaret Henderson, her motherly concern overriding her amazement at his transformed presence, but Samuel stepped away from her touch as if he couldn't see her, his eyes maintaining their fixed stare toward the front of the church. A rigidity that seemed almost catatonic had been taken on by his body, and his breathing had become slow and deep, as if he were in some kind of trance state. To a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the church dropped the boy's voice, each word seeming to hang in the air with supernatural clarity. Tell them. Tell the men of the deep places. When the sun stands still in the sky on Wednesday, let no man go beneath the earth. The mountain is hungry and it remembers the blood that was spilled in the sacred place. It will feed on the children of those who disturbed the sleeping spirits. Then Samuel spoke words that would be remembered and debated for generations. Wibi Yatishkai. The mountain spirits speak through the child who was born in shadow and raised in light. But the gift comes with a price. Each vision tears a piece from the seer's soul. And the mountain grows hungry for more. Beware, for what was taken from the sacred place will be reclaimed, and the debt will be paid in silver and bone. As suddenly as it had begun, ended the episode. Several times blinked Samuel, looked around the church with genuine confusion at all the staring faces, and asked his mother in his normal 9-year-old voice why everyone was looking at him so strangely. No memory of what had just occurred had he, and his immediate concern was whether he had done something wrong to upset the congregation. Powerful and immediate was the reaction. A harsh man in his 60s who had appointed himself the community's moral guardian, Elder Marcus Blackwood, stood up and pointed an accusatory finger at Samuel. That boy speaks with the tongue of heathens, he declared, his voice shaking with either fear or rage. No Christian child knows such words unless he has been corrupted by savage influences. We must cast out this evil before it spreads to our own children. But a chill of recognition at Samuel's words was felt by Sarah Denton, whose brother worked in the Silver Creek mines. She had heard her brother describe the dangerous conditions in the mines, the constant threat of cave-ins and explosions that made every shift a gamble with death. That was the day the mines always resumed full operations after their monthly safety inspection, was Samuel's warning about Wednesday. If there was even a chance that the boy's words carried truth, tried to maintain order, Reverend Matthews, shaken to his core by what he had witnessed, while wrestling with theological questions that had no easy answers. Was this divine revelation speaking through an innocent child? Or was it something darker and more dangerous? Deeply troubled him was the boy's use of what appeared to be Native American words, especially given the persistent rumors about Samuel's true origins that had circulated quietly through the community for years. A different kind of recognition stirring in his memory was felt by old Willem Strauss, who had spent 40 years in mining camps throughout the Colorado Territory. Familiar sounded some of the words Samuel had used, fragments of Ute language he had learned during his early days in the territory. Of the sacred place where blood was spilled had spoken the boy, and Willem knew of such places, sites where conflicts between miners and Native Americans had left lasting scars on the landscape and, according to Ute beliefs, on the spiritual realm as well. With the trained eye of a man who had seen various forms of mental disturbance, observed the proceedings Dr. Ezra Keller, a traveling physician who had arrived in Pine Ridge the previous day to treat an outbreak of winter fever. But Samuel's episode didn't fit any of the patterns he recognized from his medical training. Too coherent and purposeful for a seizure disorder had been the boy's speech, too specific for hysteria, and too controlled for the kind of religious mania that sometimes affected frontier communities. Slowly dispersed the congregation after Reverend Matthews offered a closing prayer that asked for divine guidance in understanding what they had witnessed, but long into the night continued the conversations, with neighbors visiting each other's cabins to discuss the implications of Samuel's prophecy. As a divine warning that must be heeded at all costs, or it some. As evidence of demonic influence that threatened the spiritual safety of their entire community, viewed it others. For rational explanation searched still others. Perhaps the boy had overheard adult conversations about mining dangers and his imagination had transformed that knowledge into prophecy. Immediately after the service took Samuel home Thomas Henderson, embarrassed and deeply concerned about his family's standing in the community. Intense discussion among the townspeople was spent the rest of Sunday, with opinions ranging from calling for the boy's immediate removal from the community to organizing a prayer vigil for his spiritual protection. As a child's imagination running wild dismissed the incident, the more practical residents, influenced by too many Bible stories and frontier legends. But Samuel's words carried weight beyond mere childhood fantasy was known by 3 people in that church. That Wednesday was February 21st. Remembered Jacob Miller, who ran the general store and maintained contacts with Silver Creek through occasional trading expeditions, the day the Silver Creek mine typically resumed operations after their monthly safety inspection. To visit Pine Ridge that very Wednesday had been expected by Sarah Denton, bringing supplies and news from the mining town. And the kind of geological warnings that old-timers had learned to respect recognized in Samuel's words by William Strauss, even when they came from unexpected sources. A decision that would haunt them for the rest of their lives was made by these 3 individuals. To wait and see if the boy's words would prove prophetic, they chose, treating Samuel's vision as a test of faith rather than a warning to be heeded immediately. To Silver Creek about the strange prophecy sent word none of them. If God would truly speak through a child they wanted to see, or if the incident had been nothing more than an overwrought imagination combined with unconsciously absorbed adult knowledge. With the kind of agonizing slowness that makes minutes feel like hours and hours like days passed the 3 days that followed Samuel's disturbing prophecy. Completely normal seemed the boy himself during this period, playing with the other children when weather permitted and helping his adoptive mother with household chores. Of his episode in church showed he no signs of remembering, and when his parents gently questioned him about it, he looked at them with genuine confusion that seemed impossible to fake. Constantly found herself watching Samuel during those days. Margaret Henderson, searching for any sign that another episode might be coming. Small things that perhaps only a mother would observe noticed she, the way he sometimes paused in the middle of playing to stare toward the south where Silver Creek lay hidden beyond the mountain ridges, how he seemed unusually sensitive to sounds, often asking her if she had heard something when she heard nothing at all. His increasing restlessness as Wednesday approached was most troubling of all, a nervous energy that reminded her of how animals behaved before severe storms. Far from normal during this waiting period, however, were the adults of Pine Ridge. Along lines that revealed deeper tensions about faith, reason, and the proper response to the unexplained had fractured the community. That Samuel represented a spiritual threat to their community had become convinced the most vocal faction, led by Elder Marcus Blackwood. To his mysterious origins, his strange abilities, and now his use of what they believed to be heathen language pointed they as evidence that he had been corrupted by dark influences. Each day spent hours visiting different families. Blackwood, building support for his belief that Samuel should be removed from Pine Ridge for the safety of the other children. About false prophets and the dangers of allowing evil to take root in a Christian community cited he biblical passages. To parents who had noticed their own children's fascination with Samuel's unusual abilities and worried about the influence he might have on their spiritual development were his arguments particularly persuasive. Saw Samuel as a vessel for divine revelation. A smaller but equally passionate group led by several of the town's women, including Sarah Denton and Martha Caldwell. That met in secret formed they prayer circles, asking God to protect the boy and to help the community understand the meaning of his prophecy. By Samuel's obvious distress during his episode had been most affected these women, seeing in him not a threat but a child who needed their protection and support. In defending Samuel was particularly vocal Martha Caldwell, whose own son had died in a mining accident 3 years earlier. That God often spoke through children and innocents, argued she, citing numerous biblical examples. By her own grief and her desperate hope that perhaps divine intervention could prevent other families from experiencing the loss she had endured was partly motivated her passionate defense of the boy. Between these extremes found themselves caught the majority of the town's people, uncertain what to believe but unwilling to dismiss the incident entirely. Acutely aware of their dependence on each other and on forces beyond their control had made them the isolation of their mountain community. Less absurd than it might have in a more connected modern setting seemed in such an environment the possibility of prophecy. Partly out of medical curiosity about Samuel's condition, and partly because the winter weather made travel dangerous, had extended his stay in Pine Ridge. Dr. Ezra Keller, the traveling physician. Considerable time observing the boy spent he, looking for signs of epilepsy, hysteria, or other conditions that might explain his unusual episode. But in perfect health appeared Samuel, showing none of the telltale signs of neurological disorder that Keller had learned to recognize during his medical training. Some interesting details about Samuel's background did reveal Keller's observations. Unusual knowledge of plant medicines and natural remedies showed the boy, often helping his adoptive mother prepare treatments for sick neighbors. An uncanny ability to predict weather changes possessed he, often warning of storms hours before they arrived. Most intriguingly, an instinctive understanding of human nature seemed he to have, often knowing when adults were upset or worried, even when they tried to hide their emotions. In intense prayer and contemplation spent those 3 days Reverend Matthews, studying his Bible for guidance on how to handle what might be divine revelation or demonic deception. Each day visited he the Henderson family, observing Samuel carefully for any signs of spiritual disturbance or unusual behavior. Utterly ordinary seemed the boy during these visits, perhaps quieter than usual as if sensing the tension around him, but showing no trace of the otherworldly presence that had manifested in church. For a situation like this had not prepared him the Reverend's theological training. The importance of Scripture and reason in spiritual matters emphasized Presbyterian doctrine, but it also acknowledged that God could work in mysterious ways. Between his intellectual skepticism and his growing sense that something genuinely supernatural might be occurring in his community found himself torn. Matthews into Samuel's prophecy and its possible meanings had begun his own quiet investigation. Meanwhile, Thomas Henderson, a practical man who preferred facts to speculation, was he, and he decided to learn more about the circumstances of Samuel's discovery and the history of the area where the boy had been found. Far more revealing than he had expected would prove this investigation. Of older residents and traders who had known the area before Pine Ridge's establishment, through careful questioning began Thomas to piece together a more complete picture of the site where Samuel had been discovered. As a sacred place where their medicine men went to seek visions and commune with ancestral spirits had been known to local Ute bands, the location. Random travelers had not been the small family group that had been killed there, but rather guardians of the site, people who had been entrusted with maintaining its spiritual significance. By a group of prospectors who believed the Native Americans were hiding gold or silver in the area had been carried out the attack that had destroyed Samuel's birth family. That these men had tortured their victims suggested local rumors, trying to force them to reveal the location of imaginary treasure. Everyone had been killed and the camp burned to cover their tracks by the prospectors when no treasure was found. Hidden in the root cellar by someone who had given their life to protect him had only Samuel survived. In a different and more troubling light cast this information Samuel's prophecy. Some kind of inherited memory or unconscious knowledge passed down from his birth family might be the boy's warnings about Silver Creek, not supernatural at all. Of how Native American children were taught from infancy to read the signs of the natural world, had heard stories Thomas, to understand the language of animals and the moods of the earth itself. Inadequate would prove Thomas's growing rational explanation for his son's behavior, however, when he learned more about the specific site where Samuel had been found. Any sacred place was not just the location, but rather a site specifically associated with prophecy and vision-seeking. Often possessed unusual abilities according to Ute tradition, children born at such sites, gifts that allowed them to see beyond the normal boundaries of time and space. About the timing of the attack that had orphaned Samuel was more disturbing still what Thomas learned. In late spring of 1858 had it occurred, just as several mining claims in the Silver Creek area were being established. For investors who would later become the owners of the Silver Creek mine had been working the prospectors who had killed Samuel's family. Too specific to be mere coincidence seemed the connection between Samuel's traumatic past and his prophecy about mining disaster. An impossible decision found himself facing Thomas as Wednesday morning approached. Should he trust in his son's supernatural gift and send a warning to Silver Creek, risking ridicule and potentially dangerous accusations of fraud? Or should he maintain silence and hope that the boy's words had been nothing more than the product of an overwrought imagination combined with unconsciously absorbed knowledge about mining dangers? By events that none of them could have predicted would ultimately be taken out of his hands the decision. With the kind of pristine mountain clarity that made distant peaks seem close enough to touch, dawned Wednesday, February 21, 1867, and every sound carry for miles through the thin air. Through a cloudless sky climbed steadily the sun, creating exactly the kind of perfect stillness Samuel had described when he spoke of the sun standing still in the sky. obsessively found themselves checking their pocket watches. Several Pine Ridge residents as the morning progressed, calculating when the sun would reach its highest point and wondering if they were about to witness the fulfillment of a 9-year-old boy's impossible prophecy. Of his life had spent the most restless night Jacob Miller, torn between his practical nature and a growing conviction that Samuel's warning needed to be taken seriously. On careful judgment and measured responses to crisis had built his reputation the storekeeper, but something about the boy's prophecy had shaken his usual confidence. In his store as dawn broke found himself staring toward the mountain path that led to Silver Creek and wrestling with a decision that seemed to have no clearly right answer. Numerous and valid were Miller's practical concerns. Dangerous was the 20-mile journey to Silver Creek even in good weather, requiring travel over narrow mountain passes where a single misstep could send horse and rider plummeting into ravines hundreds of feet deep. Even more treacherous had the recent heavy snows made the path, and Miller knew that attempting the journey alone would be foolhardy. Based on a child's vision seemed equally irresponsible, but sending someone else to deliver a warning, especially if that person was injured or killed making the attempt. The potential consequences of interfering with Silver Creek's mining operations were more troubling still. By the Denver Silver Company was owned the mine, a powerful organization with connections to territorial government and federal mining interests. As sabotage or fraud could be interpreted false warnings about mine safety, carrying legal penalties that could destroy not just Miller, but the entire Pine Ridge community. Could drive them from their mountain home forever. The backlash if Samuel's prophecy proved false. In mining country remembered he also his own experiences, the sudden collapses and explosions that could kill dozens of men in seconds. To such disasters had lost he friends, and had learned to respect any warning, no matter how unlikely its source. His sense of responsibility for the lives that might be lost began to outweigh his concerns about the risks of action as the morning sun climbed higher. An even more personal dilemma faced Sarah Denton. At the Silver Creek mine worked as a shift foreman her brother William, and she knew he would be underground that Wednesday, leading the first full crew back into the depths after their monthly safety inspection. For different times had written him a letter she, trying to find words that would warn him without making her sound like a woman driven mad by frontier isolation and religious hysteria. In frustration had ended each attempt. That a 9-year-old boy had prophesied disaster during a church service could she explain? About his origins that might endanger the Henderson family could she describe Samuel's use of what sounded like Native American words without raising questions? And on the visions of a child he had never met could she ask her brother to risk his job and reputation by halting mining operations based? By her own growing belief in Samuel's gift was complicated Sarah's internal struggle. For years had watched the boy she, noting his uncanny ability to predict weather changes and sense when people in the community were ill or in distress. In places where no one else had thought to look had seen him find lost items she. And his almost supernatural understanding of animal behavior and natural phenomena had witnessed she. Then her brother's life might depend on whether she could find the courage to act on that belief if Samuel truly possessed some kind of prophetic ability. His decision had already made, however, old Willem Strauss. By learning to trust his instincts about underground dangers had survived cave-ins in Pennsylvania, Colorado, and Nevada. The 73-year-old prospector, even when those instincts seemed to contradict practical logic. With his decades of mining experience had resonated something about Samuel's prophecy, triggering warning bells that he had learned never to ignore. For what he knew would be the most dangerous journey of his life had spent the night preparing Willem. Painful made mounting a horse his arthritis, and risky made navigating treacherous mountain paths his aging eyes, even in good conditions. With emergency supplies had loaded his saddlebags he and written letters to be delivered to his relatives in case he didn't return. What Miller and Sarah Denton had only considered was ready to attempt by dawn a desperate race to Silver Creek to deliver a warning that might save lives or might mark him as a dangerous madman. Just as the sun cleared the eastern peak set out from Pine Ridge the old prospector, riding his sturdy mountain horse along the narrow trail that wound through pine forests and across precipitous passes. Under the best conditions was treacherous the path, requiring constant attention to avoid loose rocks, hidden ice patches, and sections where winter storms had washed away portions of the trail entirely. In more ways than one knew he was racing against time. William. Before Samuel's predicted noon disaster needed he to reach Silver Creek not only, but early enough to convince the mine supervisors to take his warning seriously. He also needed to arrive. In good weather took 6 hours normally the journey, but the recent snows and Willem's own physical limitations made the trip even more challenging. His horse, a reliable mare named Constance who had carried him through many dangerous situations, seemed to sense the urgency of their mission, and picked her way carefully but steadily along the treacherous path. Meanwhile, back in Pine Ridge, Samuel Henderson was experiencing something that would later be described in medical journals as post-episodic anxiety. Though he had no conscious memory of his prophecy, his body seemed to remember the stress and trauma of the event. He was restless and irritable, unable to concentrate on his usual activities and asking his mother repeatedly about the time. Torn between comforting her son and fighting her own growing dread about what the day might bring, found herself Margaret Henderson. By several neighbors was observed Samuel's behavior during those morning hours, who would later provide detailed accounts to investigators. That the boy seemed to be listening to sounds that no one else could hear, noted Mrs. Agnes Caldwell, often pausing in his activities to tilt his head toward the south, where Silver Creek lay hidden beyond the mountain ridges. That Samuel's pupils were dilated and his pulse elevated, observed Dr. Keller, symptoms that might indicate either illness or extreme stress. Most unsettling of all was Samuel's increasing verbalization of his anxiety. Though he couldn't remember his prophecy, he began speaking about the men in the dark places and expressing worry about people he claimed to see in his mind. "They're going too deep," he told his mother during the late morning hours. "The mountain doesn't want them there. Something bad is waiting in the deep places." With household tasks and familiar routines tried to calm her son Margaret Henderson, but Samuel seemed incapable of focusing on anything except his mysterious concerns about unknown people in underground locations. So obvious was his distress that several neighbors stopped by the Henderson cabin to check on the family, creating an impromptu gathering of worried adults trying to comfort a child whose fears they couldn't understand or address. With forced normality went about their daily activities the rest of the Pine Ridge community, but an undercurrent of tension ran through every conversation and interaction. Closer to home than usual were kept children, as if their parents feared that whatever had affected Samuel might be contagious. More carefully than necessary checked their tools and supplies men, as if preparing for some undefined emergency. In small groups gathered women, ostensibly for quilting or cooking, but actually to share their fears and speculations about what the day might bring. Detailed observations of the community's collective state of mind spent the morning making Dr. Keller, noting how a single unexplained event had created ripple effects throughout the social fabric of Pine Ridge. About mass hysteria and collective delusions had taught him his medical training, but what he observed in Pine Ridge didn't fit those patterns. On each other's fears seemed to be feeding rather than the community members, individually struggling with questions about faith, reason, and the nature of reality itself. Toward its zenith climbed the sun as, found themselves glancing frequently toward the south, even the most skeptical residents, and listening for sounds that might carry news from Silver Creek. Of the settlement seemed muted and distant the normal activities, children playing, axes chopping wood, the blacksmith's hammer ringing against heated metal. Over Pine Ridge had settled a strange quiet, as if the entire community was holding its breath and waiting for something that none of them could clearly define. According to Thomas Henderson's carefully calibrated pocket watch, at exactly 23 minutes past noon, the earth moved. A traditional earthquake, wasn't it? Before had experienced those the residents of Pine Ridge, and they knew the rolling wave-like motion of true seismic activity. Different was this, a sudden, sharp jolt that seemed to come from deep underground, followed by a low rumble that echoed through the mountains for nearly 30 seconds. In their frames rattled windows, from shells fell dishes, and off their feet were knocked several people, but no significant structural damage occurred in Pine Ridge itself. To anyone who had spent time in mining country was unmistakable, however, the sound of a mountain falling in on itself. Was it the sound of millions of tons of rock and earth shifting suddenly into spaces that had been carved out by human hands? Of a mine collapse? Was it the sound, and from the direction of Silver Creek had it come? Samuel Henderson, who had been pacing restlessly around his family's cabin all morning, suddenly stopped moving and stood perfectly still for nearly a minute. Then, in a voice that was his own but carried an echo of the authority that had possessed him 3 days earlier, he said, "The crow brought them to the light. But 23 sleep now in the mountain's belly, and their silver dreams have turned to stone. This time Samuel retained some memory of his words, though he couldn't explain why he had spoken them or what they meant. Accurate to the very last person would prove the specific numbers, 17 and 23. But for several agonizing hours would learn this no one in Pine Ridge. With a terrible mixture of vindication and horror that left the Pine Ridge community reeling were filled the hours following the distant collapse. In the most dramatic way possible had been proven accurate Samuel's prophecy. But too overwhelming for most people to process rationally were the implications of that accuracy. If the boy had truly foreseen the disaster, how many lives might have been saved if they had acted more decisively on his warning? And if he possessed such abilities, what did that mean for their understanding of faith, science, and the nature of human consciousness itself? From an unexpected source came the first concrete news, not from Silver Creek. On the mountain trail leading to Pine Ridge appeared around for that afternoon a lone rider, moving at a speed that suggested either urgent news or mortal danger. Deputy Marshal Franklin Curtis from the territorial capital proved to be the horseman, who had been traveling to investigate reports of claim jumping in the Silver Creek area when the mine collapse occurred. News that confirmed everyone's worst fears brought Curtis. A catastrophic collapse that had trapped dozens of workers underground had suffered the Silver Creek mine. Completely had caved in the main shaft and 2 secondary tunnels, burying the mine's central operations under thousands of tons of rock and debris. Were underway rescue efforts, but the extent of the damage made recovery of survivors unlikely. For Pine Ridge, more importantly, reported Curtis that an old prospector named William Strauss had arrived at Silver Creek just before the collapse with a warning about potential danger. From the most dangerous sections of the mine had convinced the mine supervisors to evacuate 17 workers. Strauss and these men had been safely above ground when the disaster struck. Too deep in the tunnels to reach in time had been, however, 23 other workers, and they were presumed dead. Like a physical blow hit the Pine Ridge community, the deputy marshal's news. Down to the exact numbers of survivors and casualties had been accurate Samuel's prophecy, a precision that seemed impossible for anyone to achieve through mere guesswork or environmental sensitivity. The timing and nature of the disaster had predicted not only the boy, but had somehow known the exact human cost it would exact. Specifically to question William Strauss about his warning and its source had come to Pine Ridge Curtis, having learned from Silver Creek residents that the old prospector had come from the mountain settlement with advanced knowledge of the collapse. The first of many official inquiries into what had become known as the Pine Ridge Prophet case would prove to be the deputy marshal's investigation. By nightfall had not returned himself William Strauss, and his absence created another layer of anxiety for the already shaken community. That the old man had been injured in the collapse reported Deputy Curtis, not seriously, but enough to require medical attention and prevent him from making the dangerous return journey immediately. About William's condition as soon as possible had promised to send word the deputy, but difficult under the best circumstances was communication between Silver Creek and Pine Ridge. As the community processed the day's events began to sink in the implications of William's heroic journey. On a 9-year-old boy's vision based solely had risked his life to deliver a warning the old prospector, and that decision had saved 17 lives. 40 instead of 23 would have been the death toll from the mine collapse without Samuel's prophecy and William's courage to act on it. Into something approaching a genuine prophet had transformed him the mathematical precision of Samuel's prediction from a possibly disturbed child. New fears and questions that the community was ill-equipped to handle also brought, however, the confirmation of Samuel's abilities. If the boy could foresee mining disasters, what other tragedies might he predict? And perhaps more troubling, what if his vision showed events that couldn't be prevented, only witnessed? Too heavy for a child to bear seemed the weight of such knowledge, and about the psychological toll that prophetic abilities might exact on Samuel himself began to worry many residents. In the unprecedented position of trying to provide medical explanations for phenomena that seemed to transcend normal human capabilities found himself Dr. Keller. Some interesting physiological details revealed his examination of Samuel after the mine collapse. To normal levels had returned the boy's pulse and blood pressure after the collapse occurred, as if some internal tension had been released. No longer dilated were his pupils, and his previous restlessness had been replaced by a profound exhaustion that suggested his body had been under severe stress during the preceding days. More intriguingly, more memory of his second prophetic episode than he had of the first seemed Samuel to have retained. About 17 and 23 people could he remember speaking, though he couldn't explain why those numbers had seemed important or how he had known them. Relieved after the earth shook felt he also, as if some burden had been lifted from his shoulders. Complex and often contradictory was the community's reaction to these developments. Vindicated found their faith in his abilities those who had initially supported Samuel, but also discovered that having a genuine prophet in their midst was more unsettling than comforting. Something none of them had anticipated or prepared for was the weight of moral responsibility that came with access to prophetic knowledge. By the undeniable accuracy of his prophecy found their position complicated Elder Blackwood and his faction, who had viewed Samuel as a spiritual threat. That the boy had been wrong or that his vision had been the product of delusion couldn't they argue. But that God would choose to speak through a child of unclear origins who used what they believed to be heathen language couldn't they also accept. That Samuel's abilities came from dark sources was to argue their solution, and that the community should be even more vigilant about protecting themselves from his influence. As the people who had correctly identified his gift found themselves elevated to new prominence, the women who had formed prayer circles to support Samuel. But that being right about Samuel's abilities brought its own burden of responsibility, discovered they also. Why hadn't they done more to ensure that the warning reached Silver Creek more quickly if they had truly recognized divine revelation? Heavily on their consciences weighed the knowledge that their hesitation might have cost lives. Perhaps the most difficult challenge of all faced Reverend Matthews. For dealing with prophecy that seemed genuine but came through channels that challenged traditional Presbyterian doctrine provided no clear guidance. His theological training. Questions about the source of his abilities that Matthews wasn't sure he wanted to answer raised the boy's use of what appeared to be Native American words during his visions. Through the boy's unusual background filtered, was this divine revelation, or was it something else entirely? In prayer and study trying to find biblical precedents for Samuel's situation spent long hours the Reverend. Of God speaking through unexpected messengers found he numerous examples, but about false prophets and the dangers of accepting supernatural claims without careful discernment found he also warnings. Impossible made dismissal the accuracy of Samuel's mind prediction, but implications that could reshape the community's entire understanding of faith and revelation carried acceptance. In ways that made them deeply uncomfortable found themselves at the center of attention Thomas and Margaret Henderson. With a mixture of awe and fear that clearly disturbed the boy now looked at him neighbors who had previously treated Samuel as just another child. From other settlements drawn by rumors of the prophet child began arriving visitors, seeking their own supernatural guidance or simply satisfying their curiosity about the unusual case. Increasingly persistent questions about Samuel's origins and background also faced the Hendersons. Old rumors and suspicions about the circumstances of his adoption had revived the boy's use of Native American words during his prophetic episodes. About exactly where and how he had found Samuel found himself repeatedly questioned Thomas, with some questioners clearly hoping to uncover evidence of supernatural influences in the boy's past. Samuel's own reaction to his newfound status was most troubling of all. That something fundamental had changed in how people viewed him seemed to understand the 9-year-old, and he didn't like the transformation. More withdrawn and anxious became he, often asking his adoptive parents if he had done something wrong to make people afraid of him. A child who simply wanted to play with his friends and help his family without being treated as something supernatural or dangerous was clearly affecting the weight of adult expectations and fears. Beyond the immediate region, as news of the Pine Ridge prophet spread, began to receive visits from people with various agendas. The community. For their own problems came some seeking prophetic guidance. To investigate claims of fraud or deception arrived others. For financial gain or public notoriety hoped to exploit Samuel's abilities still others. Fresh complications and forced the Hendersons to become increasingly protective of their son's privacy and well-being brought each new arrival toward a crisis that would test not only Samuel's abilities, but also the community's capacity to handle the consequences of harboring a genuine prophet was building the pressure. Sooner than anyone expected would come the answer, in the form of a visitor whose arrival would change everything once again. On Sunday, February 25, arrived the crisis that would define Samuel Henderson's legacy, exactly 1 week after his initial prophecy, in the person of Dr. Harrison Blake, a Denver physician whose interest in neurological disorders had been sparked by garbled reports of the prophet boy making their way through Colorado Territory's medical community. A man of science in the purest sense was Dr. Blake, someone who believed that every phenomenon, no matter how seemingly supernatural, could be explained through careful observation and rational analysis. A collision between faith and science that would leave no one unchanged represented his arrival in Pine Ridge. With a bag full of primitive medical instruments and a head full of theories about epilepsy, hysteria, and the effects of high altitude on developing brains had traveled to Pine Ridge Dr. Blake. In cases where religious communities had attributed supernatural powers to individuals who might actually be suffering from undiagnosed neurological conditions was he particularly interested. That he was dealing with either deliberate fraud or an interesting example of how brain disorders could manifest in ways that seemed prophetic to unsophisticated observers had convinced him. His preliminary research into Samuel's case. With the return of Willem Strauss coincided the doctor's arrival, who had finally recovered sufficiently from his injuries to make the journey back to Pine Ridge. A first-hand account of the mine collapse that provided disturbing new details about the accuracy of Samuel's prophecy brought with him the old prospector. According to Willem, correct had been the boy's prediction not just in its timing and general nature, but in specific details that seemed impossible for anyone to have known in advance. That Samuel's mention of the crow brings light to the shadow places had proven literally accurate, reported Willem. At the entrance to the mine's most dangerous tunnel had been found a dead crow, a section that hadn't been used in months but was scheduled to be reopened on the day of the collapse. Only to the mine supervisors and a few senior workers had been known information about the tunnel's reopening, part of an expansion plan that no one in Pine Ridge should have possessed. Even more unsettling was the accuracy of Samuel's phrase about silver running red with blood. An underground stream that now flowed red with iron oxide through the ruins had been ruptured by the mine collapse, creating exactly the visual described in the boy's prophecy. That Samuel's use of Ute words during his vision had been authentic phrases had also confirmed Willem, words that meant the mountain remembers and death sleeps in the deep places, words that the old prospector recognized from his early mining days when he had worked alongside Native American guides. With the skeptical attention of a trained scientist listened to these accounts Dr. Blake, looking for inconsistencies or evidence of embellishment that might explain away the seemingly supernatural elements of Samuel's predictions. Increasingly difficult made dismissal, however, the precision of the details and the credibility of the witnesses. That a direct examination of the boy was necessary to determine whether Samuel was a genuine medical anomaly or simply a clever fraud supported by a community invested in believing in miracles, decided he. During the Sunday morning service came the doctor's opportunity, when Samuel experienced another prophetic episode that was even more dramatic and specific than his previous visions. With visitors who had come to witness the famous prophet child was packed the church beyond capacity, creating an atmosphere of expectation and tension that seemed to affect everyone present. Normal throughout the week following the mine collapse, confirmation had seen Samuel, showing no signs of the otherworldly presence that had possessed him during his prophecies. But as Reverend Matthews began his sermon, once again stood up the boy with that strange dignity and authority that transformed him before the congregation's eyes. Different were Samuel's words this time, however, more personal and more terrifying than his previous predictions. Individuals in the congregation directly began addressing him instead of speaking about distant disasters, describing events from their private lives that he couldn't possibly have known through normal means. The same otherworldly authority as before carried his voice, but now it was focused with laser-like precision on the secrets and hidden shames of the people around him. "Mrs. Elizabeth Carmichael," said Samuel, his pale green eyes fixing on a middle-aged woman in the fourth pew. "The baby you lost last December was not taken by fever as you told your neighbors. The child was born too early because of the medicines you took, the herbs you gathered in secret to prevent the birth. God sees your grief, but he also sees your guilt." White as chalk went Mrs. Carmichael's face, and she began to shake violently. One she had shared with no one was the secret Samuel had revealed, not even her husband. During her pregnancy had she indeed used abortifacient herbs, desperate to avoid having another child in their already struggling household. That fever had taken the baby, had told everyone she, when the pregnancy ended in miscarriage, carrying her guilt alone for months. Continued Samuel, turning his attention to a young man near the back of the church. "Peter Atwood, the gambling debt you have hidden from your family will bring violent men to this place within the fortnight. They seek not just money, but blood, and your shame will endanger innocent lives. The cards have marked you for death, and death follows you home. pale and began looking frantically around the church. Peter Atwood, a 19-year-old who worked as a hunting guide for visiting prospectors, as if expecting armed men to burst through the doors. To his creditors in Silver Creek was known his gambling problem, but a secret he had desperately kept from his family and community was it. Over smaller debts had killed people who owed him money to was real the threat of violence, but Samuel's words to Dr. Blake himself created the most chilling moment of the entire episode. Directly on the physician turned his otherworldly gaze the boy and spoke in a voice that seemed to carry echoes of ancient judgment. "Dr. Harrison Blake," said Samuel, each word falling like a stone into the absolute silence of the church. "You have come here seeking to explain away God's mysteries with your instruments and theories. But you carry your own darkness, Doctor. The patients in Denver who trusted you with their minds and souls. How many died under your experimental treatments? How many suffered because you valued knowledge more than healing? You seek to cage the eagle's flight, but some mysteries are meant to remain hidden. Beware the price of knowledge, Doctor, for the mountain sees all debts and demands payment in kind." As if the boy's words had physically struck him, felt Dr. Blake. In its accuracy was devastating. The reference to his experimental treatments on patients in Denver had indeed been conducting unauthorized experiments. Blake, testing theories about brain stimulation and neurological manipulation that had resulted in at least one death and several cases of permanent mental damage. His most closely guarded secret were these experiments, known only to him and carefully concealed from medical colleagues and authorities. But with his revelations wasn't finished. Samuel back to address the entire congregation, turning about his own origins in terms that provided the most chilling revelations. Yet spoke he. "The child who speaks to you now was born in the shadow of the sacred mountain," said Samuel, his voice taking on those same mute inflections that had marked his previous prophecies, "in the place where the old spirits dwell. The blood that flows in his veins carries the memory of the medicine workers, the seers who read the mountain's moods and spoke with the voices of the ancestors. But this gift comes with a terrible price. Each vision tears away a piece of the seer's soul, and the mountain grows hungry for more." Details about his discovery that Thomas Henderson had never shared with anyone then revealed Samuel. Of hiding in the root cellar while his birth family was tortured and killed above him described he, of the sacred ceremonies he had witnessed before the attack spoke, and how the trauma had locked away his inherited abilities until stress and isolation had finally broken through the protective barriers his young mind had constructed. Explained. "The old ways, remember," continued Samuel, his voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate from the church walls themselves. "The mountain spirits speak through the child who was marked by blood and raised in the light of the Christian God. But the gift is borrowed, not given, and the debt grows larger with each use. Soon the mountain will call in its debts, and the price will be measured in more than silver and stone." When Samuel made a prediction that would prove to be his most accurate and most tragic reached its climax, the episode. At Dr. Blake looking directly, spoke words that would haunt the physician for the rest of his life. "The man of science seeks truth through suffering, but truth has its own appetite for pain. Before the moon grows dark again, Doctor, you will face a choice between knowledge and mercy. Choose carefully, for the mountain keeps careful accounts, and some debts can only be paid with one's own soul." Then, in a moment that no one present would ever forget, from prophetic authority to childlike confusion and terror changed Samuel's expression. Some awareness of what had happened during his episode seemed he to retain for the first time, and the weight of the revelations he had shared appeared to crush him. Began to weep he, not the tears of a frustrated child, but the deep, soul-wrenching sobs of someone who had been forced to carry burdens too heavy for any human being, let alone a 9-year-old boy. A crisis that threatened to tear the Pine Ridge community apart created the immediate aftermath of Samuel's most devastating prophetic episode. That several families had fought desperately to keep hidden had been exposed, the personal revelations he had shared during his vision, while an atmosphere of fear and paranoia that affected everyone in the settlement created his predictions about future dangers. Public knowledge overnight became Mrs. Carmichael's secret about her miscarriage, leading to harsh judgment from some community members and awkward sympathy from others. For the first time learning the truth about their lost child, struggled to reconcile his grief with his wife's deception. Her husband, from the revelation, would never fully recover the couple's marriage, and eventually leave Pine Ridge to start over in a place where their tragedy wasn't public knowledge, would they? Every bit as dangerous as Samuel had predicted proved to be Peter Atwood's gambling debts. Looking for him arrived in Pine Ridge within 2 weeks of the prophecy, armed men from Silver Creek, forcing the young man to flee into the mountains to avoid violence that might have endangered the entire community. In Pine Ridge again was never seen he, though for years persisted rumors about a hermit living in the high country who matched his description. The most dramatic confirmation of the boy's prophetic abilities would provide, however, Dr. Blake's response to Samuel's revelations. By the accuracy of Samuel's knowledge about his secret experiments shaken, with understanding the neurological basis of the boy's gifts became obsessed the doctor. Despite the growing protests of the boy's adoptive parents extended his stay in Pine Ridge indefinitely and began conducting increasingly invasive examinations of Samuel. Fascinating details about Samuel's condition revealed Blake's medical investigation. Significant head trauma sustained during early childhood showed signs the boy, consistent with the violent circumstances of his family's death. That might account for his extraordinary sensitivity to environmental stimuli. More intriguingly, his brain seemed to have developed unusual neural pathways. The result of his brain's remarkable capacity to process subtle information about geological activity, human behavior, and environmental changes in ways that appeared supernatural, but were actually hyper-evolved survival mechanisms. Theorized Blake Samuel's prophetic abilities were a severe physical toll were taking also revealed the doctor's examination Samuel's episodes. The boy's energy seemed to drain each prophetic vision and leave him in a state of profound exhaustion that lasted for days. That the episodes were becoming more frequent and more intense were signs more troubling still, suggesting that Samuel's abilities might be spiraling beyond his control. To trigger prophetic episodes under controlled conditions led him to make increasingly desperate attempts. Blake's growing obsession with Samuel's case. Various forms of stress and stimulation subjected he the boy to, hoping to understand the mechanism that produced his visions. Despite the protests of Thomas and Margaret Henderson conducted these experiments would prove to be the fulfillment of Samuel's prophecy about the doctor facing a choice between knowledge and mercy. When Blake's experimental treatments triggered a prophetic episode that was unlike any Samuel had experienced before came the crisis. Specific predictions about future events instead of his own death began describing visions the boy, images of himself lying still and cold while the doctor stood over him with instruments that had pushed too far into the mysteries of the human mind. That his experiments were endangering Samuel's life faced with clear evidence, the moral implications of his obsession with scientific knowledge was forced to confront Dr. Blake. With devastating accuracy had come true the boy's prophecy about choosing between knowledge and mercy, and that his pursuit of understanding had led him to the brink of destroying the very phenomenon he sought to explain, realized Blake. To the Colorado Territorial Medical Association after he left Pine Ridge submitted the doctor's final report that Samuel Henderson represented a unique case of neurological adaptation to extreme trauma. That the boy's prophetic abilities were the result of brain damage combined with inherited knowledge from his Native American heritage theorized Blake, creating a form of consciousness that could process environmental information in ways that seemed supernatural but were actually the product of extraordinary neural development. Warnings about the dangers of studying such phenomena too aggressively contained, however, Blake's report also. That Samuel's abilities were inherently unstable concluded he, and that attempts to understand or control them might ultimately destroy both the gift and the person who possessed it. That the boy be left alone to develop naturally recommended the doctor, with medical intervention limited to supportive care rather than invasive investigation. Accurate proved Blake's predictions about the unsustainable nature of Samuel's abilities. His prophetic episodes became less frequent and less precise as the boy entered adolescence. Had stopped entirely by the time he reached his 15th birthday the visions, leaving him with only fragmentary memories of his time as Pine Ridge reluctant prophet. To return to normal after the revelations and disruptions caused by Samuel's prophecies struggled the community itself. To start over elsewhere left Pine Ridge some families, unable to bear the weight of exposed secrets or the fear of future revelations. An uncomfortable distance from the Henderson family stayed but maintained others, treating Samuel with a mixture of respect and fear that never entirely disappeared. By his encounters with Samuel's gift found his own faith permanently changed. Reverend Matthews. The boy's visions to be genuine divine revelation never publicly declared he while, after 1867 showed a new humility about the limits of human understanding and the possibility that God might work through channels that challenged traditional religious doctrine his sermons. for generations would influence Pine Ridge Presbyterian Church, the Reverend's theological evolution, creating a community that was more open to spiritual mysteries and less certain about the boundaries between natural and supernatural phenomena. A quiet, thoughtful man who used his inherited sensitivity to natural phenomena in more practical ways grew up to become Samuel himself. A respected surveyor and mapmaker became he, helping to chart the Colorado mountains with an accuracy that reflected his unusual ability to read the land's hidden features. Sarah Denton married he, whose brother had been one of the 17 miners saved by his prophecy, and in a Pine Ridge that had learned to accept mysteries without demanding explanations raised they 3 children. Of his childhood experiences as a prophet rarely spoke Samuel, but that he never entirely lost his sensitivity to the mountain's mood said those who knew him well. With uncanny accuracy could still predict weather changes he and seemed to know instinctively when geological conditions were unstable. Quietly and practically used he these abilities, however, helping his neighbors prepare for storms or avoid dangerous areas without ever claiming supernatural knowledge. Far beyond Pine Ridge itself extended the legacy of Samuel's prophetic abilities. Throughout the Colorado Territory and beyond spread word of the case, attracting the attention of researchers, theologians, and curiosity seekers who saw in Samuel's story either proof of supernatural phenomena or evidence of how primitive communities could misinterpret natural abilities as miraculous gifts. At several medical schools became required reading Dr. Blake's reports on the case, where they were studied as examples of how extreme trauma could reshape human consciousness in unexpected ways. Early research into what would later be called psi abilities and hypersensitivity disorders influenced also the case, contributing to a growing understanding of the brain's capacity for adaptation and unusual development. A complex example of how divine revelation might work through natural mechanisms found in Samuel's story. Religious scholars, challenging both skeptics who dismissed all supernatural claims and believers who insisted that genuine miracles must defy natural explanation. To theologians studying the intersection of different religious traditions became a subject of particular interest the boy's use of Native American spiritual concepts during his Christian prophetic episodes. On the Pine Ridge community itself was perhaps the most lasting impact of Samuel Henderson's story, however. Forever changed left the settlement the experience of harboring a genuine prophet with all the wonder and terror that entailed. With a deep respect for mystery would grow up generations of Pine Ridge residents, and an understanding that the boundary between natural and supernatural might be far thinner than most people imagined. A permanent reminder of the price of dismissing warnings became the mine collapse that Samuel had predicted, no matter how unlikely their source. Partly because of the extensive damage was never reopened the Silver Creek mine, but also because of a persistent belief among miners that the site had been cursed by the boy's prophecy. To the 23 men who had died there became a monument the ruins, and a reminder that some knowledge comes at too high a price to ignore. Questions that extend far beyond the specific circumstances of his case raises in the end the mystery of Samuel Henderson's prophetic abilities. Only to have their warnings dismissed as imagination or madness have possessed similar gifts how many other children throughout history. The kind of consciousness that seems to transcend normal human limitations might create what combination of trauma, genetics, and environmental factors? And perhaps most importantly, with individuals who claim knowledge that seems impossible but proves to be true, what responsibilities do communities bear when confronted? That the line between the natural and supernatural may be far more permeable than our scientific and religious institutions are comfortable acknowledging reminds us the story of Samuel Henderson. In Samuel's abilities may say more about our own need for certainty than about the true nature of human consciousness and its hidden possibilities, whether we choose to see divine intervention, evolutionary adaptation, or neurological anomaly. That truth often lies not in the easy answers we prefer, but in the uncomfortable questions that force us to confront the limits of our understanding. Shows us this mystery. To remain open to possibilities that transcend our current knowledge while maintaining the critical thinking necessary to distinguish between genuine phenomena and wishful thinking challenges a Samuel Henderson story. What do you think of Samuel Henderson's story? Do you believe his abilities were the result of brain trauma and environmental sensitivity? Or do you think something more mysterious was at work in that isolated Colorado mountain community? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And let us know what theories you have about how a 9-year-old boy could predict a mine collapse with such devastating accuracy. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories that challenge everything you thought you knew about the world, subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves unsolved mysteries. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and remember, the truth is often stranger than fiction. And sometimes the most unbelievable stories are the ones that actually happened.